My name is James D. Decker. It's a pleasure to be joining you remotely through this recorded presentation to discuss integrated deer damage management on Michigan driving farms. I'll start with a personal introduction, and then I'll move in to kind of set the stage by describing the wildlife damage problem. For looking at some of the control tools available in terms of integrated deer damage management, and we'll round it out with a discussion of some of the available resources. I'll start by saying I'm an agronomist, not a wildlife biologist. I came to agriculture a little bit indirectly through studying environmental studies and anthropology before my graduate work in crop sciences. And when I started with MSU Extension in Presque Isle County 12 years ago, it was really clear to me that wildlife damage was a major issue for producers in that part of the state. And I've been doing research and outreach on wildlife damage in agriculture since 2012. When we think about the wildlife damage problem, I think it's really important to kind of set the stage. Wildlife management in and of itself is a very complex and value-laden problem. For one, you have multiple passionate stakeholder groups and fairly high economic stakes, whether we're talking about hunters and the revenue economic activity generated through that, or also the damage that wildlife can cause in agriculture and elsewhere. We also have to navigate this complex intersection of state, federal laws, and agricultural best management practices. So depending on what species we're talking about or where and how the damage is occurring, there's a lot of policy involved as well. Then there's this thing called the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation, and this is really the philosophy that drives education and policy for wildlife management in our country. And unfortunately, the North American model is really based on assumptions of scarcity and preservation that come from the experience of removing a lot of wildlife from the landscape and working through conservation practices, hunting policy, for example, to bring those species back. So unfortunately, a lot of our wildlife management professionals and philosophy is not really well positioned to address issues of overabundance and conflict or damage. Furthermore, data on wildlife damage across the country, but in Michigan specifically, is really limited. You can see some examples here of estimates that people have tried to put together to quantify this problem. So, for example, Conover estimated that wildlife-related economic losses to farms and ranches was exceeding $4.5 billion in 2002. A more recent paper actually used crop insurance data, innovative way, to estimate losses to a few major commodities, soybeans, corn, and wheat. And you can see there, soybeans being the largest at $324 million, followed up by corn and wheat with also significant losses just east of the Mississippi in this particular case. There are some examples of research specific to dry beans and wildlife damage. Richard Long, Dick Long, is an extension educator formerly in Presque Isle County, and he did some work in the 1990s where he found 24 to 43% yield loss in kidney beans at that time. And that was followed up by the work of a graduate student in 1996 who reported between 0 and 32% or 9.8% average losses for kidney beans related to deer in Northeast Michigan at that time. While we don't have a lot of direct measurements or even good, robust estimates of wildlife damage and the cost of that damage, one important thing to consider is that there are often differences between perceived and real losses due to wildlife damage. So, for example, when we ask growers to estimate wildlife damage, it's a very difficult task for me as well, without getting on your hands and knees and directly measuring it. So it's important to understand where those estimates are coming from and how accurate they may be. But there was an interesting study in 1995 in Michigan that looked at farmers' perceptions of what is significant when it comes to yield loss, as well as hunters. And at that time, they found that there was some agreement that losses to deer greater than 10 to 15% of the crop, or about $20 per acre, were viewed as significant by both of these parties at that time. And when we're talking about the social aspects of this issue, I think that's really critical to understand kind of where those different perspectives align. One of the biggest drivers of wildlife damage currently is actually the loss of hunters. So for game species like white-tailed deer, the primary way that we've controlled their populations is through recreational hunting. And unfortunately, we're seeing a pretty precipitous decline in hunter participation. So here you can see hunting license holders in relation to U.S. population trends. So as the population has increased from 1960 to 2025, in this case, the relative percentage of folks that are buying hunting licenses and the overall number of hunters has declined quite a bit. The upper Midwest, Michigan in particular, is kind of the hotbed for this trend where we're seeing some of the largest decreases in hunting license holders. And so we really have a significant problem specifically here in Michigan relative to some other parts of the country. In 2019, we did a small grower survey in Michigan and a couple surrounding states, and I just share this to point out a couple of things. One, that growers feel like this is an important issue, 81% in the case of our survey sample, and really feel like the currently available resources are inadequate. The other thing that really stood out in this study is the breakdown of species causing damage. So cervids, deer, and elk are definitely the most significant, followed up by birds. So most of my presentation today is going to focus on deer damage specifically. When we think about how deer damage occurs in dry beans as a crop, I think there's a couple of important things to consider. One is that a lot of my experience, a lot of the research that has been done in wildlife damage in agriculture is focused on soybeans. So I will share a few different examples generated from a soybean production system, but I think a lot of that information translates to dry beans as well. One important point is that early season defoliation is generally more impactful in terms of yield reduction. So you can see here one study found that significant defoliation prior to V5, or really kind of in the vegetative growth stages, can reduce soybean yields in that case. If you think about it, if a plant is just emerging from the soil or in its early growth stages, a few bites from a deer could totally eliminate that individual plant. Whereas as the season goes on and the plant grows, the relative percentage of tissue that's going to be removed by deer browsing decreases. And so you have kind of the early season period where damage is really significant and needs to be controlled to protect yield. And then you have what I think is kind of the wild card, which is pod feeding. Pod feeding seems to be variable, whether it occurs or not, across geographies, individual animals, as well as the crop or variety that you're growing. So we have experiences where we do a great job protecting the crop early, and then we see a lot of damage right at the end of the season. Another important point that has been demonstrated through the research is that damage is not equal, certainly, and we see that damage is generally concentrated in smaller fields and near wooded field edges, and that's really the case across cropping systems. Another aspect of deer damage that I think is important to discuss is that certainly you have direct damage and the yield loss and the cost associated with deer directly eating the crop, but you also have the indirect effects of wildlife damage, and this is a great example here. So here you see an exclosure in the foreground where we kept deer out of a soybean field, and then you see the rest of the field that was heavily browsed by deer, and the big difference here is late season weed pressure. So if plants remain undamaged, they close canopy in a reasonable time, late season weed pressure is going to be drastically reduced as compared to a browsed field where the canopy stays open and weeds can persist and grow and set seed and cause problems for years to come. I'd like to talk about wildlife damage management in the context of IPM. So the objective of IPM is to mitigate risk while managing pests, and that could be, the financial costs of pest management, issues like pesticide resistance, or in the case of wildlife repellents, habituation to those control measures. With wildlife, we really do have a lot of valuable beneficial attributes of these species, right? So IPM allows us to focus on making space for that while also addressing the issue and reducing the costs associated with wildlife damage. IPM accomplishes all of these goals by applying advanced knowledge of pest ecology, anticipating, preventing, monitoring pest damage, and combining multiple control tactics. And, IPM in the general sense is often motivated by something like pesticide resistance. Well, as we'll discuss, we have this complex social aspect of wildlife damage management, but also the efficacy of some of our tools, particularly our chemical control tools, is quite a bit less than we see with other types of pesticides. And so those are a couple of reasons why I think taking an IPM approach is so important when we're talking about wildlife damage. There's a similar concept in wildlife biology called wildlife damage management. And this is defined as the art and science of manipulating habitats, wildlife, and humans to alleviate damage issues. And what I like about this is that it incorporates the human element. Because we're talking about charismatic species that hold a lot of value for different stakeholders, we have to consider the social aspect and look at how humans are driving policy and driving decision making. This figure from a 1959 publication really points out how important that human dimension is in the case of wildlife damage. So, you may be somebody that enjoys viewing wildlife and you see them as this representation of wild nature and beauty. You may be a sportsman or woman that enjoys hunting and views them as a trophy. Or when you put your farmer hat on, you may see them as a hungry pest, as in the picture to the right here. And what is so interesting to me about this issue is it's not just individual stakeholders that identify with one of these different perspectives on deer or wildlife, but individuals can hold these varying value sets at the same time, right? So maybe during the growing season, I'm a farmer and complaining about deer damage and concerned about the cost, and then come November 15th, I'm a hunter, and so the layering of these multiple value sets can really limit, I think, implementation of the control tools that are available out there, because we want to enjoy hunting as much as the next person, right? Or maybe our family comes and hunts on the farm, but we still have to do the work to manage wildlife damage and protect our farm business. When we think about all the different variables that influence deer damage, it really is a complex problem. And this figure from 1989 kind of points that out, that extent of deer damage can be based on simple things like deer density in your area, but also all of the practices that influence deer density or deer distribution and movements, like baiting, like harvest activity. And then there are other environmental aspects too, in terms of what we're growing, where we're growing it, the character of those crops and fields, and variability in deer food preferences that I'll touch on a little bit later. So it is an incredibly complex problem, and as a result, highly variable across the landscape. And so what works on one farm may not work on another. And also, we need to think about managing this problem at the landscape scale so that we can account for all of these variables in some sort of structured way to actually make progress. And for that reason too, I'll argue that policy changes are really necessary to really move the needle on this issue. So combining these concepts of integrated pest management and wildlife damage management, we come to integrated wildlife damage management. And these are some of the key questions or considerations that I think are important when we're talking about addressing wildlife damage on the farm. So for example, where is the damage occurring? Is it specific areas of the farm? Is it certain crops that we're growing in rotation? What's the associated habitat? What species are causing damage? And how does land use intersect with all of those variables? Another important question is about when the damage is occurring. Is there a particular season, phase of the crop, time of day or night that might give you some thoughts about how to implement controls effectively? Of course, we have to consider the economics, the cost of damage versus the value of wildlife. Damage and yield loss, economic thresholds for implementing some of these controls, as well as some of the more nuanced aspects of your personal tolerance or social acceptability of the control tools that you want to implement, as well as legality for that matter. And then what resources are available for controlling the problem? So what is allowed in terms of regulations? What tools are actually available? How well do they work? And then what does it take to implement them in terms of time, labor, and capital? For the next several slides, I'm going to touch on these different categories of control tools available for wildlife damage management. So cultural control in terms of habitat modification, biological control in terms of population management, all the different mechanical tools that are available out there, a physical approach, and then even some of the chemical controls. When we think about cultural control for wildlife, it really comes down to habitat modification. So that can be as simple as field and crop selection. Are you growing dry beans in fields that are likely to see wildlife damage based on their location, their size, the adjacent habitat? What alternative food sources are available? This is actually one of the biggest factors. So, what's growing in the next field? What are your neighbors growing, and what alternative food sources are available? If there's a good alternative, it's going to be much easier to reduce deer damage on your field because the deer will have somewhere else to go. We can also think about managing deer movement in terms of travel corridors, and I think there's a lot of promise in that, but not a lot of implementation at this point. Could think about things like field buffers or trap crops. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then if the adjacent land use is forestry, if it's cover for deer, how is that forest habitat being managed? Is it being managed in a way that provides good food, for example, through harvest of those trees and regeneration? Or is it an old kind of stagnant, aged out forest that really isn't providing food, just cover? And lastly, predator habitat can contribute to wildlife management as well. There's also this aspect of variety palatability. So we know that wildlife preference varies by crop species, but also variety and nutrient content. When we look at the literature, there's a number of quality factors that seem to drive deer preference. Mixed diets, higher digestible dry matter, nutritive values, particularly sugar content, and then lower anti-quality factors. And then the question becomes, can we identify important quality factors that are behind more or less palatable varieties and actually implement that as a management strategy? We've done some looking at this issue of variety palatability in soybeans. So I'll show you a little bit of results of this. So we actually compared 3 different soybean varieties, and we looked at the relationship between their tissue sugar content and the amount of browse that they were incurring. And this was inspired by some looking that we had done. We had noticed differences in browse pressure across soybean varieties. We collected tissue and we sent it in for a forage analysis. And what stood out is that the one parameter, forage quality parameter, that correlated very strongly with deer damage was water-soluble carbohydrate or sugar in the leaves. And so again, in this more controlled study, we found that comparing these 3 different soybean varieties, there was a pretty strong relationship between tissue sugar content and the damage that the deer were causing. And the varieties grouped up fairly well, where we saw some differences in sugar content by variety, where the 2 Asgrow varieties in this case had higher sugar content than the Dairyland variety. And that aligned very well with the percent of damaged plants in this case that we saw out in that field. So there definitely seems to be some relationship between tissue sugar as a quality parameter and deer preference that I imagine could carry over very easily to dry beans. There may be other quality or anti-quality factors that are also important in terms of deer preference across dry bean classes or dry bean varieties, but this one has really stood out in soybeans. The idea then with these high and low sugar soybeans is that maybe we could implement them in habitat modification as field buffers or trap crops. So could we plant them along the edge of a field and hopefully keep the deer in that area, or maybe in an adjacent food plot area, and prevent them from going out into the main field. So we can hopefully leverage deer behavior both in terms of food preferences but also location. They like to feed on the edge. Maybe timing based on relative maturity of the cash crop variety versus a trap crop variety, and hopefully provide some multifunctional space that could be useful for forage or biomass, maybe some sort of riparian buffer, or provide habitat for other beneficials like insects. But we're really just beginning to scratch the surface on this concept, and look and see if it's really possible to make this work. In terms of population management or biological control, again, to be effective, because deer move, this has to be sort of a landscape scale cooperative approach. Individual farms really struggle to implement lethal control in a way that makes a big dent in the damage that they're seeing. This information, or this practice, has to really be driven by information on deer densities, and an understanding of the population both in terms of quantity and quality. Hunter recruitment, as we mentioned, and retention is a huge issue. So do we have enough hunters? But then also, can they access farms and private land where a lot of the deer are at and where the damage is occurring? So regular hunting is an option, but increasing hunter access through things like the DNR's Hunter Access Program, or there's a new group called the Michigan Hunt Collaborative that is setting up hunts specifically on farms that are seeing wildlife damage. But it also involves processes through DNR to access special permits like deer management assistance permits or crop damage permits, and then ultimately collecting data on that harvest as well to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. I think it's important to highlight the regulatory aspects of where permitting is required and not. So I share this just to point out the fact that not all wildlife species are managed by the same agencies. So some game species are managed at the state level by Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and deer would be an example of that, and permits are required to use lethal control. But other species are managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Some species that can cause damage on farms do not require permits to implement lethal control. So this is just a quick reference guide to that. Another aspect of population management that I think is important to point out is the role of predators. So they do offer natural population control. I'm located in the Upper Peninsula. We have wolves. We have fewer deer, partially related to that. Other predators like black bears, coyotes can play a role in this as well. Of course, there's the concerns about conflicts from the predators themselves with livestock producers and others, but we do have biological control tools for the predators themselves, like donkeys if you're a livestock producer, strategies that you might consider implementing to allow space for predators, for controlling wildlife damage in your crops, but also protect your livestock. There are a number of mechanical control tools available, lights, lasers, effigies, water jets. Many of these can be effective, but the important thing for all of them is that habituation will occur, and so you have to switch it up, implement multiple different tactics, and move them around to keep them dynamic. One of the most effective strategies for reducing wildlife damage is physical barriers or fencing. And I want to point out that there's many different types of fencing available. So while 100% exclusion can be achieved by 8 to 10 foot welded wire fence like you see there in the picture, you may be able to use other types of barriers or fencing that are less expensive or difficult to implement and still get a significant reduction in damage, depending on all those variables that we looked at earlier in terms of what alternative food sources are available, what sort of deer densities do you have, how used to using your field the deer are, and all of these things. This is a table from a great paper from Vercauteren et al., looking at a comparison of different types of fencing in terms of cost, height, efficacy, longevity, and maintenance, and just showing that there are trade-offs here, right? So you may not need 100% efficacy, and so you can look at reducing your cost, but you may have, for example, more maintenance requirements. With fencing, we really want to try to make it as efficient an investment as possible, and we do that by looking at the what's called the perimeter to area ratio. So you can see here a couple of things. One, fencing regularly shaped, particularly square fields, will give you the most return on your investment, and then the larger the area as well will make that fencing less expensive per unit area protected. So if you're going to fence regularly shaped fields and larger fields if possible. I did a quick analysis with some basic assumptions about dry beam production to give you a sense of maybe how long it might take to pay off a deer fence. So here we're looking at years to pay off of a square 40-acre deer fence based on cost and average yield loss. So here we're assuming 25 bags per acre dry beam yield at $30 per hundredweight for a price. And you can see a few things. One, as you increase the amount of damage that's occurring from left to right columns, so from 5 to 100% yield loss, obviously the payoff is quicker with greater yield loss. And then as you also increase the size of the field, so most of these rows are showing a 40-acre field with the different cost per linear foot of fence. If you bump that up to 80 or 160 acres, even at $20 per foot on fencing, you start to reduce the years it takes to pay off that fence. And in general, I think this table points out the fact that if you're experiencing moderate damage, it may not take as long as you think to pay off a deer fence. So say that cost is $10 per foot, but you're losing 50% of your crop on that field. It's only going to take 4 or 5 years to pay off that fence. So I think a lot of people assume that fencing is just too expensive for field crops and commodities, but it may be less expensive than you think. Moving on to chemical control, here we're talking about repellents, and for wildlife we have two main categories of repellents. One are contact repellents, where they're applied directly to the vegetation, they're deterring via taste or physical discomfort, and then you have area repellents, and this is a product that can be applied on or near the vegetation, and it's deterring usually via odor or some other volatile aspect. In general, repellents are expensive and not always easy to apply. You have a wide range of active ingredients. Some are exempt and have these broad labels. Some are not labeled at all for your crop. And so you really have to look carefully at what's available out there to find something that would be labeled for dry beans. In general, they have to be renewed fairly regularly, so we're often talking, 2 or more applications to protect even just that vegetative phase. And what we found through our research is that efficacy is highly variable and context dependent. So the active ingredient matters certainly, but the same repellent may be very effective in one field and less effective in another because of all the different landscape factors that we mentioned earlier. This is a table from a great meta-analysis from 2020 that looked at many different repellent ingredients, and they were able to kind of show which ones are most effective. And in general, those based on meat, blood, predator urine, hair, or feces came out best for controlling deer damage. Second in line was some of the sulfurous compounds like putrescent eggs or hot pepper. And then some of these other active ingredients were generally not effective. And we've seen the same thing in our research. As we round out here, I want to discuss this concept of phase 2 wildlife management. And this is a new kind of adaptive approach to management of overabundant and invasive wildlife species. So it's reconsidering that North American model of wildlife conservation, emphasizing wise use and utilitarian ethics over scarcity and preservation. So the idea is that it would be a science-driven approach with public data not only on wildlife populations and the goals, but the cost-benefit analysis in terms of managing these species and what it takes to mitigate damage. The types of tools that would be an important part of a phase two approach, certainly data and education. So data on wildlife populations, ecology, and damage is sorely lacking, as we've seen. Some of the data from the 1990s is about all that's available out there specific to dry beans, believe it or not, and deer. So we're making progress on education and research in Michigan, which is great, but there's a long way to go, particularly to measure wildlife damage and its costs and to compare that with the benefits that wildlife bring. Social programs, because wildlife damage is so much a social and ecological problem as it is a technical one, efforts to educate stakeholders through things like wildlife cooperatives, QDMA, and the interaction between stakeholder groups. For example, the Deer Management Initiative that DNR conducted earlier this year to understand various perspectives on this issue. And lastly, I think economic incentives are absolutely critical, particularly as we lose hunters and the recreational tools that we have used historically to manage deer populations and other game species. We need to look at things like, for example, Wisconsin has what's called the Wildlife Claims and Abatement Program. And that program redirects hunter license dollars toward abatement efforts, so fencing, repellents, etc., that farmers can implement to address wildlife damage, and also pays claims basically as an insurance program for wildlife damage in the state of Wisconsin. And then I think we could take it even a step further and look at something like regulated commercial hunting, or even bounties for deer, right? Creating economic incentives to address this issue, because some of the social incentives, recreational hunting being the main one, may not be what they used to be. I'll leave you with some of the resources that are available through Michigan State and some of our partners on wildlife damage. So we've got our Wildlife IPM webpage. We've created some different educational resources like the bulletin series you see here. We've done podcasts on this issue that are also hosted on the IPM webpage. And then certainly, depending on what species you're talking about, if it's game species at the state level, Michigan DNR is going to be the best resource, or also USDA Wildlife Services is available to assist generally with non-game species, but they can provide technical assistance in some cases as well, even for things like deer. So thank you for your attention and time. It's been a pleasure to share this information with you. And feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. Happy to discuss more. And hope you enjoy the rest of your meeting. Thank you.